Coming up on today's Locked On Bucks, we take a look back at Monday night in Cleveland. The Bucks are now 1-6 on the season. So, what are some of the takeaways coming out of that? And do they really involve the young players? Have we seen a changing of the guard for the Milwaukee Bucks? Camille and I get into that discussion next on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia, joined as always by Camille Davis. We thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen each and every day. And even better news, as your favorite podcast is now a newsletter, introducing the Locked On Bucks daily newsletter, your one-stop shop for ultimate team and league coverage delivered right to your inbox. Sign up for free now at lockedondaily.com. That is lockedondaily.com. And start your day with the all-new free Locked On Bucks newsletter. Today's episode of Locked On Bucks is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. 1-6, Camille, is certainly suboptimal to be at this point in the season for the Bucks. I talked a little bit about this on my post-game show Monday night, and I heard you and Frank mentioning some of the same, but I guess I do want to get to the big picture with this team, but I think the elephant in the room is obviously the young players, and there has been a group of Bucks fans that have been calling for it even before the season started. I think you and I were hopeful that we would see some from the young guys, but also remained somewhat on guard of, well, look, it's a veteran team and there's a lot of people that they're going to have to leapfrog, especially when you bring in a Gary Trent and a Taurean Prince and Delon Wright. We've seen a very slow start for Gary Trent. Not anything that should make you say, well, it's over, you got to bench him. But what we saw Monday night, I think, is the clearest path out of this. And that is, I think we talked about this late last week, and that, hey, Ajax just, I don't care if it's 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever, you just got to find a spot for him going forward. And we both mentioned this, perplexed that AJ Green wasn't in the rotation for most of the early part of the season, but he especially, I still think over Andre absolutely needs to be playing 20 or so minutes a game. And Monday night in Cleveland just reinforced that. So I think that's where most Bucks fans are. I do think that's where Doc Rivers and his staff have arrived as well. The question now becomes, okay, where do those minutes come from?
Yeah, that is the question. And going into Monday's game, I was really interested in seeing how the minute allocation played out and what the rotation looked like, given the fact in that prior Cleveland game, you saw it was the season low for Pat Connaughton at the moment. Bobby Portis only played like 20 minutes, I believe, in the first Cleveland matchup. So I was like, hey, I wonder how this carries over into that next game, because we heard Doc Rivers mention that there needed to be consequences to players not executing effectively. So I was like, I wonder how this continues. But then you hear the news that Giannis was out. And so, this is going to throw everything into a tizzy as it is, because you got to find a way to soak up those Giannis minutes. So Bobby started in his place, of course. Bucks, 3-man, big rotation. So that made sense. You saw a lot more Pat Connaughton in the game. But within that, Pat Connaughton actually had one of his better games of the season, which was good for him. It's good for the team. But all in all, I do still think that going forward, I would like to see more AJ Green. If that comes at the expense of a Pat Connaughton, then I'm fine with that at this point. The point of attack defense is not an area for AJ Green where I'd say it's super strong, but situationally, it's still better than what I've seen so far this season from Pat Connaughton in those same situations. We know what AJ Green can do when he's hot from three as well. We saw it on Monday against Cleveland when it was falling. And to that point, AJ Green in that game against Cleveland on Monday, one of the quicker triggers I've seen from him where he was not hesitating to shoot. He knew what his role was and he was looking to get those threes up. So I would love to see more AJ Green. Love to see Andre get through the game without fouling like crazy. Like that was in itself a win. Want to see more of
Zero
that.
fouls.
Right, no fouls the whole time he played. So more of that from Andre, but I think that part of the solution of quote unquote fixing the Milwaukee Bucks is just getting some of those young guys some more run.
Yeah, and that's the interesting part is where the minutes come from. I mean, I already know Bucks fans are going to come in and say, Pat Connaughton, get him out of the rotation. And look, as we've mentioned, it hasn't been a great start to the season for Pat Connaughton. He did play well against the Cavaliers, but we have to start to see that consistently. And I think it's also reached the point of there was 2 years ago when Pat was basically your small ball 4 in some closing lineups. Not so much heavy volumes of that we saw against Cleveland, but we saw some of that because they had to play small. And it was just when the Cavs would go back to Allen and Mobley that you realize, okay, we
gotta go big.
Yeah, we're gonna get just thrashed if we're playing small against that group. It does feel like that's kind of the usage, though, for Pat Connaughton of picking your spots where we can play small and we can incorporate him into that. That's kind of where we're at. But, AJ Green, we've talked about it for over a year now. Frank is kind of to the mea culpa, too, of, wow, he can actually defend. And I think all of us just assumed he couldn't. I thought he was really good defensively against the Cavs on Monday night. His closeouts, how he's just able to stick to guys. And I mean, we've talked so much about the issues starting on the defensive end. I think that's your flashing LED sign of like, okay, he's got to play. And so does Andre Jackson. And you just figure it out along the way. A few people or one person commenting, and I've seen this quite a bit too, of like, man, Bucks are really going in for Cooper Flag, huh? Yeah, I mean, that's right. That's the urgency of this, of like, well, you don't have the pick, so it does you no good to be in the lottery here. I have some more questions about the rotation and what it could look like when a certain player returns, but there's a caveat with that as well, as it seems that things are complicated. So we'll continue this discussion coming up after the break here on Locked On Bucks. This next segment of Locked On Bucks is brought to you by Hims. It is changing men's healthcare by providing you with access to affordable sexual health treatments from the comfort of your couch. Hims provides access to a range of doctor-trusted ED treatments like chewable hard mints and Viagra and Cialis, and they're generic for up to 95% cheaper. The process is 100% online, so there's no need for uncomfortable doctor's visits. Just answer a series of questions on their site, and a medical provider will determine the right treatment option. If prescribed, your medication ships directly to you in discreet packaging for free. No insurance is needed, and one low price covers everything from treatments to ongoing care. With hundreds of thousands of trusted subscribers, Hims can help you find the ED option that works for you. Start your free online visit today at hims.com/lockedon. That's HIMS.com/lockedon for your personalized ED treatment options. hims.com/lockedon. The products mentioned are chewable, compounded products which are not approved by or verified for safety or effectiveness by the FDA. Prescriptions require an online consultation with a healthcare provider who will determine if appropriate. Restrictions apply. See website for details and important safety information. Subscription required. Price varies based on product and subscription plan. So the other question that I had, Camille, is, I talked about this Monday on my post-game show, was the more I've seen, there's a lot of knee-jerk reactions. I get it. You're 1-6. As much as we can point to, hey, the process has looked a lot better in these last 2 games. And I mean, really for the last week, it's a much different story if you win those 2 games against the Bulls and the Brooklyn Nets, right? Because you played the Celtics relatively well for 3 of those quarters. Not a great week, not a great game against the Memphis Grizzlies. So that's another caveat there. But then 2 games against the Cavs that you lost by a combined 3 points, and one of them you played without Giannis. The process does look better, but you're 1-6. Now, the optimism and the reasons for look, it's not over. And I know Eric Name brought this up in the post game with Doc, and I've seen a few people point out the raw numbers too. It's 12 teams that have made the playoffs after starting 1-6 in the NBA. And I think I tried to find who they were. I think one was the Wizards from a couple of years ago, and I don't recall who the other one was. But those were the most recent ones. The thing that makes you think, look, it's not like it's over. It's not great, but it's not over. Is the Sixers are 1-5.
Mm-hmm.
The Pacers are 3-4. The Knicks are 3-3. The Heat are up there in the playoff mix right now at 3-3. I mean, right now, the Heat, the Bulls, and the Nets are all in the top 6. The Magic are 3-5. They're going at it without Paolo Banchero for an extended period of time here. Yeah. So, you got the worst record in basketball, tied for it with the Utah Jazz. It's certainly not ideal, but the fact that the Bucks and Sixers are a combined 2-11 and in 14th and 15th place, that right there, I mean, they are going to make the playoffs. And Doc Rivers was pretty adamant about that afterwards too. Just all those names we mentioned. The Brooklyn Nets are not going to stay not only in the top 6, they're not going to stay in the top 10. They have no incentive to do so. I think the Miami Heat they're not going to stay in the top 6. The Pistons right now are 10. Maybe they finish there, right? Mm-hmm. But there's all these teams that are going to start to fall back a little bit. Now, the big part is you can't just sit back and wait and say, okay, these teams are going to start losing. We're good. Like, you got to be an active participant in your own rescue here. You got to start winning games. But that's the big part, is it is still early, and, it shines a brighter light on it because it's your first 7 games of the season. But, from the 4 seed, you're 2.5 games out. The 3 seed even, you're 2.5 games out of that. And, what if they do finish this week with 3 straight wins, where you beat a team that not only should you absolutely need to beat the Utah Jazz tomorrow night, but then what if they follow that up with wins against the Knicks and the Celtics, and all of a sudden this team is 4-6? I'm guessing that would prop you all the way up to 10th or so, and start to make some movement there. And it just changes the optics. I still go back to, granted, the Bulls and the Nets have played much better than we've anticipated, but those 2 losses, it just kind of shows you the spot that this team is in, that you can't afford those type of setbacks. But if you win those, the outlook, even if you split it and you're 2-5 right now, not great, but it's a much different outlook.
Yeah, and it's about how you lost as well. That's why we keep going back to the Chicago game, to the Brooklyn game, because as you're watching the game, you're seeing the Bucks not execute the basic things they need to do. The offensive rebounding for other teams was a problem. The transition defense was a problem. It was a situation where you're like, if you just are focusing, if the defensive switching was a problem, like if you're communicating, executing, it looks a little bit different. So to see the effort that they put out in those games, and it's like, doesn't feel like you even trying. And this is a Bucks team that we saw last year that had problems of at times playing, I shouldn't say at times, problems playing down to competition where they're losing games you expect for them to win. And that was a problem. So against Boston, against Cleveland, I expected them to come out looking sharp. What I'm really looking to see is against the Jazz on Thursday, how do you come out and how do you play in this game? Yeah. Because as you mentioned, yes, 1-6, not ideal. You're looking at it. I think it was Dane who mentioned it. Like, it's even worse because it's at the beginning of the season. So there's more attention on you. A lot of teams go through losing streaks at times. It happens during the course of a season. It's just happening at the very beginning for us. And we got to figure out a way out of it. And again, that starts with Utah. The season isn't over yet at this point. People who are already saying blow the team up and make trades at this point in the season, before we even get to December, when a lot more players are eligible to be traded, it's just short-sighted at the moment. Like, give them some more time to figure this out. You might find over the course of the next few weeks that certain players don't fit the scheme and the team as good as you might have hoped for, and then you can try to make some moves from there. But for me, the idea of giving up on Dame and Giannis already feels short-sighted. But when you look at the team and what they have going up against them, I mean, it's not it's not impossible for this team to still be a playoff team. Like the reasons I had for optimism of this team, I can still see within them. They just have to execute it and then find the right rotations to make sure that when the starters do hit the bench, you're not leaking points at that point. And it feels like Doc is trying to figure that out. He's mentioned looking and searching for the right rotations. He's also mentioned wanting to play a little bit smaller once Khris comes back, which I know we'll talk about a little bit more in the next segment. But I think that there are still ways to play small without Khris that could be beneficial to the team. We've seen a few of those lineups in very short minutes at this point in the season. It's all, small sample size theater at this point, but there's a way that you can see this team coming out of this. And again, 1-6 is not ideal, but we did just see 2 years ago, the Lakers start 2-10 and then make it to the Western Conference Finals. Like there are ways for a season to turn around, but they can't continue to waste time figuring it out. Like they got to get that win starting on Thursday.
No, and look, what this start has done is something that I dismissed and thought was crazy. It's opened the door for maybe you have to be in the play-in tournament to get into the playoffs because of what we've seen. It's still early. That there's still, as we just mentioned, how bunched up it is. I mean, that's the good and the bad about it happening now is, there's 75 games left for you to really start to dig out of this. And the fact that nobody's really running away with any, there are 2 teams above 500 in the East right now. So are you going to be the 1 seed? No, that was a long shot to begin with. You're not going to be the 2 seed. I don't think you're going to finish 3rd. You're probably looking at, okay, we can get up to 4th. But that being said, maybe they do get to 3rd for that simple reason of 2 teams are over 500 in the Eastern Conference right now. It's just the fact that it's coming right now, the first 7 games of the season, that brings the most attention and makes it seem worse than it really is. Look, I'm not trying to spin this as, hey, it's actually good and they're in a good spot, but
they've been playing bad.
Yeah, I don't think it's to the depths that some would suggest quite yet. Now, it can get there if you don't start to turn things around here. And that's where the Utah game, I hate using hyperbole here, but it's a must-win game. Like, you cannot lose that game to the team that's tied with you for the worst record in the league and drop to 1-7. Like, if that happens, then you do start to have some serious questions of what's going on here. I know we've all kind of pointed to Khris Middleton's return, and there's a lot with this too, not only with some of the relatively vague updates we got from Shams Charania yesterday, but just the whole picture of what does this change for the team? The pressure that is undoubtedly going to be heaped on Khris Middleton. Like, that's also the, hey, bummer, man, that you're walking into this because they're 1-6, and now the expectations, at least from the outside, are, Khris, you need to save us. But when the Bucks do get Khris Middleton back, what we can learn from that and how we think this team may choose to play, I think that's an interesting conversation to get into. We'll shift to that coming up after the break here on Locked On Bucks. Next segment of Locked On Bucks is brought to you by Built. So we've all been there before, feeling like we're burning cash with those rent checks. It's frustrating, but here's the deal. Built Rewards has figured out a way to make rent more rewarding. Say goodbye to the money bonfire and hello to a renter's revolution with Built. Built is breaking ground as a neighborhood rewards program that hooks you up with points on your rent. Every month, pay your rent and watch the Built points roll in. Use points to jet off on dream vacations. Put your rewards total to a flight or hotel stay with airlines, 500 more, and 700,000 plus hotels and properties. You can use your points to book fitness studio classes, redeem them towards a future rent payment. They're designed to meet your lifestyle. Pay rent hassle-free through the Built Rewards app. Your rent game just got a major upgrade. Built points have been consistently ranked the highest value point currency by the Points Guy and Bankrate. Earn points by paying rent now when you go to joinbuilt.com/lockedonnba. That's join, JOINBILT.com/lockedonnba. Make sure to use our URL so they know we sent you. Join built.com/lockedonnba to start earning points with your rent payments today. Time to talk to you now about our friends over at Game Time. You've heard Camille and I talk about our experience using Game Time, the best ticketing app on the industry. Use it when you're out of market, maybe checking out a new stadium or arena you haven't been to before, and you want to know, where should I sit? Well, one way to get that answer is to find out what your seat is going to look like. You can see a panoramic view from your seat within the app before you buy. If you toggle on the all-in pricing feature, shows you the total upfront cost with no surprise fees at checkout. You can use this to get tickets to concerts, comedy, theater, sports events, you name it. Game Time has it. Comes with the lowest price guarantee, where Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference if you find those seats cheaper elsewhere. And best of all, your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time Picks. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem that code LOCKEDONNBA to get $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game Time. All right, so the update we got on Khris Middleton, Camille, was, I mean, update is putting it mildly here, but Shams Charania yesterday had the reports, and I suppose I should pull this up to read it verbatim. But the gist of it was, it's taken longer than expected for Khris Middleton, and it's still indefinite. There is no timetable for his return here. So when you see that, I think there's a lot of Bucks fans that think, well, here we go again. Season's over. Not the news that you wanted to hear. And it is certainly not ideal to hear that. When I heard it, I guess it cleared some things up for me, or when I read it, I should say, it cleared some things up for me, because I remember talking about this Monday elsewhere, in that I got to believe, based on what I had heard and just how the situation was going, that was kind of similar to the Joel Embiid situation, where it's, all right, maybe there's some more swelling going on that we anticipated, and could he play if this was game 7 of a playoff series? I know Doc Rivers has said that. You kind of get that sense. But, you know, when we talked about the health being so important, why risk it? Like, let's just wait until we know this guy's 100% and gets to 100% for an extended period of, okay, now we can play him. I go back to that and the interview that he gave to Eric Name, and just said, you know, I don't think this is like, hey, he suffered a setback and it's time to be worried, because to me, if you give that answer, you're not expecting I'm going to miss the first. And that answer, to be clear, was when he said he expected to play in a high number of games, in 60s and 70s of games played. Like, that was his expectation. And that's what he thought would define a successful season. So if you come out and say that, you're not expecting, well, I'm going to miss the first, 3 weeks to start the season. I'm not going to play in back-to-back. So, like, I do think that this is just kind of one of those, man, this is taking longer than we expected. Like, we thought it would be a handful of games to start the season, maybe the first 3 or 4, something of that nature. And then he'd be good to go, because, Khris isn't an idiot, and Khris knows what giving that answer opens yourself up for. So I do think there's a lot of that going on. But as we said, unfortunately, a 1-6 start, there was already the chatter of can't stay healthy, he's injury prone, and you should look to move on. It's going to be amplified with this start. And now even more so, people are looking at Khris Middleton to be the savior, which is not what that role is, and unfair expectations for Khris.
Yeah, it is unfair to think that he can come back and save everything wrong with this team, which is why there's been some encouragement over the last couple of games, Cleveland in particular and Boston, where you're seeing the Bucks do the things that they need to be doing, where it's like, okay, I'm seeing some progress there. But again, we want to see that progress start to result in some wins, which, again, starting Thursday. But for Khris Middleton, I think for me, I can speak for myself. Part of it's like not even an irritation, but it's just kind of like what is going on is when you hear preseason, Doc saying we're hoping we get him back for, one of the 2 preseason games and then get rolling. He doesn't play. And then now you are 7 games into the season and Sham is coming out and saying like he's out indefinitely until, the team feels comfortable with him coming back. And that takes me back to something I heard Eric Name say when he was a guest on the Bucks podcast with Marcus Johnson and Chris Johnson. And he mentioned the fact that for Khris Middleton, the team can plan around if Khris is going to be on a minutes restriction. They can plan around that and they can organize around that. What it's harder for the team to organize around if they bring him back too early. He's in the rotation. Something happens, a setback of some sort. Now he's back out of the rotation. Yeah. Like once he's cleared to play and he's good to go, even if he's on a minutes restriction, you can plan around that. What you can't plan around is if something happens because you rushed it and now he's back out the lineup and now you're scrambling to figure things out again. So to that ideology, like whatever it takes for him to come back and you feel comfortable that once he comes back, he is going to be able to remain in the rotation, of course, unless something else new happens at that point. You can't predict it, but I understand the mentality behind like, we're just trying to make sure that when he gets back to the court, we're confident he's going to be able to continue to stay out on the court. So for Khris, no, I don't see him as a savior. I do see him as somebody who helps this team be immensely better, though, given the fact it's a top-heavy roster. We knew that going into the season that this team was going to lean on Giannis and Dame and Khris, and that if any of the 3 of them were missing time or hurt, the Bucks' chances for winning a championship were going to get slimmer. So, like, yes, they need Khris, but to think that when he comes back, it's going to be just straight wins because he's back solely, that's not fair to them. And the team itself, they have enough as currently constructed to be able to get some wins, which again is why the loss to the Nets, the loss to the Bulls was so frustrating because it's like you have enough to be able to pull the win out. So it's a gut check time for the Bucks. Yes, it is early. And yes, you want Khris back, who unlocks a lot of different things, but they have to find something within them to get some wins and start that ball rolling in the right direction. And one thing I can say for this team that continues to give me hope and optimism as well is that this team itself doesn't seem to have given up yet. Like the team, the locker room, they all seem locked in. I saw Dame had a post on Instagram where, Dame just posts his fits and what's going on in life and everything like that. And to comment underneath the post from someone saying like, y'all need to fire Doc, ain't that right? And Dame responds like, absolutely not. Like, no, absolutely not. So to hear that the locker room is still behind Doc, they still seem together based on all the pressures and everything that you're seeing. It's some reason for optimism as well for the team going forward. But I say all of that to say again, you got to start getting some wins. You got to start getting some wins.
I've seen a lot of it. And I don't think we need to relitigate that discussion, but I mean, just really quickly, everybody that's the LOL Doc Rivers, you need to fire him. Like, are we forgetting what it looked like and that you are probably the same people that were calling for Adrian Griffin to be fired after 2 or 3 weeks? Like, I've seen so much of this team looks so much better with Griff last year and look at their record. Like, fine. It was the easiest record in the league. And I think you guys are forgetting the calls for him to be fired when you were struggling to beat the Detroit Pistons and needing overtime. Like the results were there. Great. The process looked terrible. And it's been unfair to Doc. I'm not saying he's a perfect coach or has done everything perfectly, but the schedule has been unfair to him that Griff had the benefit. And it's not to just point out, hey, Griff is a terrible coach. I'm not trying to say that, but he had the benefit of a very easy schedule and health. Like Khris Middleton was on a minutes restriction. He was playing in those games. As we mentioned, he's on pace to play close to 70 games. Doc Rivers comes in, the schedule gets very, very difficult. And 4 or 5 games in, Khris Middleton comes down on Kevin Durant's foot, and you haven't really seen Khris consistently. So I think that talk is annoying. It's uninformed, and it's just like, look, you can dislike Doc Rivers, you can point to some of his history. I get that. I'm not trying to sell Doc Rivers on you, but come on with this team was better under Griff. It's just not true. And I think you know that. And most people saying that are the same people that were saying Griff needs to be fired. So That's the one thing I wanted to get off my chest that just continues to pop up with this discourse around Doc Rivers. As far as Khris Middleton goes, when he does come back, and look, I've seen people point out too of, like Khris doesn't help them out at all. He doesn't improve anything that they struggle with. I mean, when Khris was on the floor last year, they were pretty good, even with a bad defense. Their defense was technically better than it finished. And I think the main thought is, look, here's where he helps your defense. You don't screw up on offense as much, that you're more organized. You have that other option. And that's really, in turn, what has killed this team is transition, that they're the value that they place on their offensive possessions that just hadn't been there, especially early in the season. That kind of bogged things down, where if you waste those possessions, you have bad shots, quick shots, teams are off and running, and then you're kind of screwed. So in many ways, you do need a good offense to help out your defense. And that's where Khris Middleton is going to help you. But I think, the other thing, and I felt this way, you and I talked about it over the summer. I felt this way for a while, but just watching that Cavs game on Monday reinforced things for me. I think when you get Khris Middleton back, as we talked about early in the show, whose minutes are Andre and Ajax going to take? It's the same discussion with Khris Middleton, and I think everybody's like, well, it just means Gary Trent plays less or Taurean Prince plays less. To me, watching this team so far and seeing what the strengths are, I think when Khris Middleton comes back, the guy that is most at risk of losing minutes is Bobby Portis, because I think we've moved to the point. We've heard Doc say, I want to play smaller. We like what we've seen with some of that, but some of those things we can't do without Khris. Okay, I take that as Khris is our small ball four. And I'm not saying this means Khris comes off the bench. I think you have to start him, if for no other, because I've heard this conversation too. And if for no other reason than you want Khris on the floor with Giannis because of that chemistry. And if you don't start him, I know you can close games with him, but you're missing out in the first quarter. Giannis checks out midway through. That's when Khris would theoretically come in. So I think he starts at the 3, but when you get into some of those moments where you need it, and especially in closing lineups, depending on the opponent, I think he's your small ball 4, or technically the 3, and you're going with he and Taurean Prince out there. That's that switchability in those small lineups that they're looking for. But to me, I know statistically Bobby Portis had a good game against the Cavs on Monday. There were still some of those moments where there's things that you just can't have from Bobby Portis, and a near 2020 doesn't offset that. So the more that you see of that, and it's been a rough start for Bobby, but what this team is going to need to do, that's not Bobby Portis' strength. He's not a rim protector. He's not a switchable guy defensively. And you need one of those two, especially if you're essentially your backup 5. And Khris can at least give you that switching ability. So I think that 7 games in, I wondered if this is where at some point we would get this season. After 7 games, I think this is where we are.
Yeah, I do too. And as we get ready to wrap up here as well, one thing that stands out to me that we've heard from Doc, he's mentioned how he's been trying to find the right rotations. He's mentioned the bench hasn't been good enough, and that's on him and the coaching staff to figure out the right rotations. I agree with you. I think that when Khris does come back, one of the guys who sees a hit in their minutes is Bobby Portis. And going into the season, like we were talking about all the different young Bucks that we could see getting more playing time and who that could be. We've had conversations. AJ Green, Andre Jackson Jr. were the two you heard a lot. And then you sign the veteran free agents, right? You bring in Taurean Prince, you bring in Gary Trent Jr., you bring in DeLon Wright. And at the time, it's like, well, this is cool because it gives insurance to those young guys as well, where it's like, hey, if you guys aren't necessarily ready, we can lean on the vets, let them kind of carry the load. And then it's not as much pressure on the young guys to have to come in and be contributors immediately. But as we have seen over the course of the first 7 games, the young guys seem to have it. Like they just seem to bring that energy the Bucks are needing. Doc has talked about the guys needing to get up to 50-50 balls more often. You see the young guys going in the game and doing that. So it's becoming the thing too, where I think it might have to be a case, at least while they're still waiting for Khris Middleton to come back, where it's like, we're going to kind of look to ride the hot hand. Who's working in this game tonight? we are going to continue to lean on you to continue playing, because we saw it against Cleveland on Monday where Gary Trent Jr. and Taurean Prince check out midway through the third quarter and they don't check back in.
Don't return. Yeah.
They don't return in that game. And it's not to say like you don't have a role in this team, period. You can't be helpful. It's just like tonight we're seeing that this is working. AJ Green is hot from three. Andre Jackson Jr. is defending well. Like, we have to continue to go on the hot hand. And I think for the Bucks, as they continue to figure out the early rotations and who's who and what guys can do and who works best with each other, that might be the route to go, just as you continue to figure things out right now. And I would hope, again, that does mean that we see AJ Green, we see Andre Jackson Jr. more consistently, because I think that at the very least, what they have shown is that they consistently deserve some more playing time going forward.
Leave your thoughts in the comments of like, what is the easiest fix for this team to pull out of this 1-6 start? But I mean, it starts tomorrow. Like we said, you don't want to get too dramatic, but you can't lose to the 1-6 Utah Jazz. We'll be back once again tomorrow to start to take a look at that Jazz game. Maybe we'll have some more developments in terms of personnel, maybe even a clearer Khris Middleton update as well. But we'll get you set for that matchup with the Utah Jazz on tomorrow's show. That'll do it for today, though. For Camille, I'm Justin. We will talk to you once again tomorrow on Locked On Bucks.